Hi guys, in this video we're looking at a famous uprising against communism in the Eastern Bloc in Czechoslovakia in 1968, called the Prague Spring. Let's jump in. In 1968, Czechoslovakia wanted freedom from the Soviet Eastern Bloc as their economy was underperforming. This led to the Prague Spring Rebellion under leader Alexander Dubček. For 4 months, the Czechs would follow their own form of communism. However, in August 1968, the USSR invades Czechoslovakia. There were non-violent demonstrations from the Czechs in response to the invasion. However, they did not use violence much because they did not want to repeat the Hungarian uprising violence. There was no action taken by the UN or any of the Western powers in this rebellion. Czechoslovakia was defeated by the Soviets, and Soviet-style communism was introduced again in Czechoslovakia. One of the key consequences of the rebellion was the Brezhnev Doctrine. This stated that the USSR will intervene in any country where communism is under threat. Let's go over the main reasons why there was discontent in Czechoslovakia at this time. Firstly, the Warsaw Pact of 1955 discouraged trade with countries outside the Eastern Bloc and promoted Soviet-style communism. There was a lack of economic freedom in these countries. Secondly, Soviet communist policies like centralization and collectivization were leading to slow economic progress. People in the East could not help but look at the people in the West flourishing under capitalism. Countries in the Eastern Bloc did not believe that Soviet-style communism was working, and they called for economic reform. And lastly, external political control. The Soviets had major control over the runnings of the Czechoslovakian court. In 1956, Czech students protested at a lack of free speech and free movement in the Eastern Bloc. And so many Czechs are relieved in January 1968 when Alexander Dubček becomes the leader of the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia, because by April of the same year he introduces reforms that counter Soviet-style communism and introduce a new form of communism or economic reform in Czechoslovakia. These are Dubček's main reforms. Travel to the West was made readily available for everybody. The border with West Germany was reopened. All industry became decentralized. Trade unions and workers were given more power. There was freedom of speech in Czechoslovakia, and opposition parties were also allowed. All of these were very popular with the Czech people. This was a threat to the USSR, who did not want Western involvement in the Eastern Bloc. However, Dubček had made clear that Czechoslovakia would remain a communist country, be loyal to the USSR, and still be a part of the Warsaw Pact. And so for 4 months, Dubček's policies were tolerated by the USSR. This period was known as the Prague Spring. However, USSR leader Leonid Brezhnev was always concerned that Czechoslovakia turning away from Soviet-style communism could lead to a domino effect, where other countries also fell away from Soviet-style communism in the Eastern Bloc. The turning point for the USSR's attitude towards Czechoslovakia came in August 1968, when President Tito of Yugoslavia visited Czechoslovakia. Yugoslavia had never signed the Warsaw Pact. They were one of the only satellite states to do so. This trip indicated to Brezhnev that Czechoslovakia was no longer loyal to the USSR. And so, on 21st of August 1968, 500,000 Soviet troops stormed into Czechoslovakia. The Czechs did not want to repeat the Hungarian uprising and the violence that occurred from that, so they responded with non-violent, peaceful demonstrations. There was the tragic and unique case of 20-year-old Jan Palach, who burned himself alive and died in protest. His funeral was attended by masses in Czechoslovakia and turned the funeral into a protest against the USSR invasion. Other people followed Jan's example and burned themselves alive after this. However, this did not stop the Soviets from overcoming Czechoslovakia. In April 1969, Dubček was forcibly removed and replaced with Gustav Husák, a leader who was loyal to Soviet-style communism. The United Nations denounced the invasion and asked the Soviets to withdraw their troops from Czechoslovakia. This was vetoed or rejected by the USSR. At this time, Cold War tensions were beginning to thaw, and Western powers did not want to increase tensions again by intervening in the Prague Spring. These are the main points of significance that came from the Prague Spring. The USSR successfully returned Czechoslovakia to Soviet-style communism. The Prague Spring also established Brezhnev's authority in the Eastern Bloc, and Brezhnev proved to the West that he was a strong leader. And finally, the Prague Spring led to the Brezhnev Doctrine, which stated that the USSR would intervene in any country where communism was under threat. Let's look at those key phrases to use when writing about the Prague Spring in your exam. The Prague Spring was significant because it reminded both superpowers that the Cold War was not over. In August 1968, the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia in response to the reforms of Alexander Dubček, who had pulled away from Soviet-style communism after a period of economic decline in the country. USSR leader Leonid Brezhnev was worried that these reforms could lead to a rejection of communism in the Eastern Bloc, as other satellite states may follow suit. As a result, 500,000 Soviet troops invaded Czechoslovakia. The Czech protesters responded without violence, cautious to avoid a repeat of the bloodshed in the Hungarian uprising of 1956. The USSR successfully returned Czechoslovakia to Soviet-style communism. This led to the creation of the Brezhnev Doctrine that stated the USSR would intervene in any country where communism was under threat. This strengthened Soviet control over satellite states by warning them that any anti-communist moves would likely result in a military invasion. Brezhnev had proven that he was still willing to escalate conflict in order to redeem communism in the Eastern Bloc. The lack of action from the UN and the Western powers highlighted their newly cautious approach to handling the Cold War, following the Cuban Missile Crisis that threatened a nuclear war. The reaction of the West during the Prague Spring foreshadowed the attempts of the US to ease tensions between the two superpowers in the 1970s, known as the period of Détente. Let's look at some common exam questions on the Prague Spring. Explain two consequences of the Prague Spring. Well, firstly, it was a temporary break from Soviet-style communism in Czechoslovakia. It lasted for 4 months, but it was ended when the USSR invaded. And secondly, of course, the Brezhnev Doctrine. This stated the USSR would intervene in any country where communism was under threat. The next question is about writing an account of the key events of the Prague Spring. For this question, just go through the events we've gone through today and use the context and facts I've given you. And lastly, explain why the Prague Spring was important for superpower relations. The Prague Spring was important in showing the superpowers that communism in the Eastern Bloc was failing and that Soviet-style communism was not bulletproof. There were countries that were threatening to become independent from Soviet-style communist rule. Czechoslovakia gave hope to future countries that they could also break free from economic and political restraint by the Soviets. Of course, over the next few years and decades to come, countries would try to break free and the Soviet Union would collapse by the end of the 20th century. I hope that gives you some context and ideas for the Prague Spring. Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you all in the next video.